Welcome, everyone. We'll get started here in just a second. Uh, Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today for the release of Pennsylvania's Bad Bet: Why Shell Didn't Save Appalachia with Plastics. This report explains how a pair of faulty economic impact studies misled Pennsylvania policymakers and residents about the economic benefits offered by the Shell Polymers Monaca petrochemicals complex in Beaver County. The studies, which were funded by Shell and published by Robert Morris University, were used to justify billions of dollars worth of tax incentives for the Shell project. My name is Ben Hunkler, and I'm the communications manager with the Ohio River Valley Institute. We are an Appalachia-based research organization helping the Ohio Valley region chart a course toward shared prosperity, clean energy, and more equitable civic structures. And we're really excited to be co-releasing today's report with the Environmental Health Project, or EHP, a nonprofit public health organization that assists and supports residents of southwestern Pennsylvania and beyond who believe their health has been or could be impacted by oil and gas development. It's my pleasure to introduce our report co-authors, Orvie Senior Researcher, Nick Messenger, Orvie Research Fellow Ann Keller, and Orvie Research Fellow Kathy Hipple, as well as Dr. Ned Katai, who's the medical advisor for the Environmental Health Project. In just a moment here, Kathy, Nick, and Ann will review key findings from the report, and Dr. Katayer will share some crucial context on how the Shell facility has impacted public health in Beaver County and beyond. We'll then have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end of the program. And lastly, before we get things running, I'd like to note that this event is being recorded and that we've enabled closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. And right after I'm done talking here, I will share a link to the full report as well as our digital toolkit and reading guide in the chat. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll pass it over to Nick to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. So as Ben shared, my name is Nick Messenger. I'm a researcher and economist here at the Ohio River Valley Institute, and I'm also a PhD candidate in the SWANK program for rural and urban policy at The Ohio State University. So from Ohio, familiar with the region. And really, this report, one of the questions I've been asked is why did we do this report, and what is the focus here? And a lot of folks have probably followed this story, for the better part of the last decade as this ethane cracker plant and this kind of promised plastics industry was formulating in southwest Pennsylvania. And so one of the questions that we really wanted to dive into is, how did this happen? How did we actually get here? We've done analysis and we've seen a lot of different groups analyze the environmental impact. We've seen, we have a report that came out late last year that looked at the jobs impact and found that, in reality, there has not really been this big economic impact. And so what actually happened that kind of went askew here? And so where we'll start on the first slide is all the way back in 2012. What happens in Pennsylvania is the state actually expands a tax credit program or a tax incentive program called the Keystone Opportunity Zone. And this really expansion fit kind of very nicely with what would eventually be the ethane cracker site in Beaver County. And this program is used to exempt most local taxes. This is really common. A lot of folks on the call who are joining us are probably familiar with economic development policy for the better part of the last 40 years has really been a one-trick pony. It's really been focused on how do we abate taxes to lure a company in to create jobs at a location. And that really accelerated as we started losing jobs to outsourcing. And really, that's the name of the game in a lot of places, is trying to entice corporations to make investments. And the main tool has been tax incentives. And in this case, what was happening was the tax incentives were a competition. West Virginia was competing for this site for Shell. Ohio was interested in the site. And so it kind of became a little bit of a race to the bottom, where the state that offered the sweetest deal was going to end up with this facility. In addition to the actual Opportunity Zone program, which abates local property taxes and local income taxes, which go to things like schools and roads and public services, senior citizen centers, healthcare, you name it. There was also an feedstock tax credit. And so this was actually subsidizing about 14% of the cost of the input ethane to the facility at the time that this went into effect. The price of ethane, and Ann will talk about the markets, but the prices have changed in the global marketplace since then. But anytime you are a business and you're looking to make a location decision, if someone's offering to subsidize about 14% of your major cost of inputs, that's a pretty sweet deal, and something that Shell clearly didn't turn down because it decided to site the plant where it did. Together, these two programs and the various taxes that they essentially abate or exempt Shell from or credit Shell with amount to billions of Pennsylvania taxpayer dollars over years and years and years. And so you're asking kind of this question in this report. We're asking this question of, if the state essentially forewent billions of dollars over multiple years in tax revenue, what did it get out of it? What was the return on investment of this major investment that the state made? So we'll go to the next slide and we'll kind of take a look and kind of start digging through. So the premise here is really that, one, taxpayers should have a positive return on investment. I think everybody agrees that if we're spending money on things and we're not actually creating jobs or economic impact, it's probably not a good idea to spend on. And then two, lawmakers passed these incentives. And the reason that they approved these incentives was because they were presented with analysis that there would be a positive return. So the economic analysis back in 2014 and then again in 21 said, oh, there's going to be a fantastic return on this investment. This is a great opportunity for the state. Here are all these projections. And what we have now seen that the plant has been constructed and has operated for a bit is that none of that impact really turned out. And this report is aiming to address why. So we'll go to the next slide and we'll kind of give the overview. So Shell in 2014 had a study that they solicited from a group at the Robert Morris University School of Business that was really, if you read stories from back then, covering the State House and covering this potential plant before it was built. All of these media stories cite or reference this RMU economic analysis. This kind of became the de facto key, piece of, this is going to create, several hundred jobs, and it's going to have all this really positive effect on the community. So that's really where we went, is we said, well, let's go back to square one and let's reevaluate the study that was used to justify all of these tax giveaways and to incentivize this plant to be built. And so there's a couple problems with the study when you read through it. First, it uses a method called input-output modeling. I won't give anybody an economics seminar, but if you look at the study that we've just put out, there's a large table that goes through the assumptions of input-output modeling, which most economists are familiar with. But the biggest one to really highlight is that input-output modeling is a great tool for connecting industries, but it isn't a market tool. There are actually, in the most common input-output model, which is InPlan, which is a commercial software package, the model actually doesn't incorporate prices. And all of us, assuming that the folks on this call are all participants in the economy, we know that prices and markets are actually very important. And so any kind of economic model that doesn't account for price changes is really going to be problematic in the long run. It might be a good snapshot, maybe in a 3-month window, but over time prices change. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that means on the next slide. Two, the study didn't consider any of the tax incentives. And so you're kind of starting out with a study that's going to say, well, we're going to evaluate the return on investment, but we're not going to include any of the investment as a cost. And you can kind of see where that logic starts off faulty, is thinking about, well, this is all going to be positive, but we're not actually comparing it to what the taxpayers would have had to put up in order to actually make this thing happen. The third problem that we kind of found with this original 2014 analysis was that it doesn't really consider what economists would call non-market costs. These are things like costs to local homeowners in their property values. Anybody who wants to purchase a home in the community is probably not willing to pay extra to live near a plastics facility, particularly one that has been in the news so much for its environmental concerns. And so you've probably seen home values decline, at least in a radius around this facility. The study doesn't account for that, right? So it doesn't account for those negative losses that local residents who own property are going to have experienced. Anybody who has any type of healthcare costs associated long-term with either pollution from the facility or just in general breathing problems from more particulate matter in the air or whatever it may be, they go to the ER, they go see their doctor, they get treatment, their insurance gets billed. Those dollars aren't factored in as costs, right? They're kind of outside of the analysis, which is kind of artificially inflating the positive impact because we're not considering all the negatives. And then finally, environmental damage. If you're polluting air or water, that has health costs, but it also just has natural costs across the board. Typically, we're also thinking about the regulatory costs, right? Every time that the state has to send out someone to monitor a complaint about the facility or to inspect the facility's pollution limits, that's actually public cost as well, right? That's dollars spent and time spent for a public regulatory employee to go out and actually inspect things. And then any type of cleanup cost is also, of course, or time and energy and money spent cleaning up damage is, of course, not considered. And then finally, even if we ignore those first three problems, the study had two other major kind of baked in problems. The first is that if you look at the appendix of the original RMU study, it actually kind of qualifies itself by saying that, well, this is all based on the assumption that Shell will produce the jobs that it says it's going to produce. Which is not really ideally how you would conduct an independent analysis like this. Normally, what you would hope is that you would go out, you would look at other facilities, other ethane cracker facilities that are already operating. You would look at real data after the fact, at how many jobs they created, how many construction workers they needed to actually get off the ground and launch the project. And you would actually try to estimate a comparable result for Pennsylvania. You wouldn't just say, hey, Shell, how many jobs are you going to make? And then Shell says, we're going to make, 400 jobs. And you say, okay. And then the rest of the analysis kind of just plays off of that initial estimate from the company. That kind of goes against what we would view as an independent economic analysis. And then finally, when you use input-output modeling, I know there's a lot here, but when you use input-output modeling, you have to classify the project within an industry. And there's a system of industry codes that the federal government uses. And actually, David Passmore, who's a professor emeritus and from Penn State, actually pointed this out. The original RMU study misclassifies the ethane cracker facility, and it uses the wrong industry code. And the industry code that it uses actually has a higher coefficient, essentially a higher ratio in the input-output model software. And so you've kind of started out giving yourself a positive advantage by misclassifying the industry. So not very well done analysis in the long run. So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of dig into some of these a little bit. When we talk about economic impact, what we're really talking about is income and jobs. Everybody loves talking about jobs, but why? Well, the first thing is that a job makes income, right? Someone works a job, they collect a paycheck. A portion of every dollar they earn gets respent. They go to the grocery store, they go to restaurants, they go to the movie theater, they pay for subscriptions to streaming services, they pay for their mortgage or for their rent. And so everybody's income becomes other people's income through spending. And that's a good cycle to have. That's what supports local jobs in the community. And so economists use what we call an economic multiplier to measure how effective a job is at essentially having a ripple effect on the region. A higher multiplier is really good. It means that every dollar that person makes, they're helping support a lot more jobs in the local community. So for a couple of reasons, input-output models like InPlan are really popular with industry because they typically produce really high multipliers. If you read some industry studies, you'll see people say, oh, this, if we build this plant, it will have a multiplier of 9. Well, that would mean every job we create is going to create 9 other, 8 other jobs in the community. And most of the region we live in, that's not reality. You can drive through communities and see that plant after plant has opened, and we don't have a magical kind of renaissance of all of these jobs just sitting there waiting for folks. And so we've kind of had an era where we've just overestimated. So if we go to the next slide, Ben, I appreciate it. What we really see here is a picture of what we're talking about, which is the RMU study should, in a perfect world, it should consider the ethane cracker's economic impact, how many people will work there. That's the green up arrow. But it should also add in the negative impacts. It should add in higher healthcare expenses. It should add in higher worker wages. Remember, I said that the model doesn't include prices. Well, if the construction workers that get hired to build the ethane cracker are hired by Shell, and Shell's receiving subsidy from the state, those workers are now being siphoned away to a new project. Anybody else in the region who wants to do a large construction project is going to have to compete with Shell. But Shell has the subsidy, and other smaller local companies probably don't have the same support from the state. And so you're in direct competition, but the large company has state support. And so you drive up wages, and it can actually have a negative impact in terms of small businesses might say, well, I can't afford to build a new warehouse, or I don't want to expand this year because, right now the labor market is expensive for construction because Shell's building the plant. The home values going down should be factored in. The cost of pollution, the cost of land going up, is people are speculating on land for other industrial uses related to this. All these red arrows should get added to the green arrow. What we really want to stress is that we're not saying it's a foregone conclusion that the red will outweigh the green or the green will outweigh the red, but this is how you would want to do an independent, thorough analysis. When you look at the RMU study and the input-output modeling, if we go to the next slide, this is what the RMU study looked at. And so it's not really surprising that we only see this prediction of really positive economic effects, because we've essentially not considered any of the sources of negative effect, both through the way that we've chosen to model it with the in-plan software, and through our choice to exclude, or RMU's choice, not ours, but RMU's choice to exclude environmental impact, and by using the wrong industry code. So you kind of start the project getting the conclusion that this is going to be positive because you don't really even consider the negative possibilities. So if we go to the next slide, I know I'm talking a lot, so we'll kind of just go through this. We're not looking at the wrong or at the right counterfactual. A lot of studies in economic development for things like this will say, well, let's compare building the plant to not building the plant. And that's not really the fair comparison. What actually should happen when the state is providing billions of dollars in tax incentives is you should say, let's compare the impact of building the plant to the impact of what we could do with that revenue instead. And that is what really needs to be compared, apples to apples. And so what we find in economics is that there's a lot of research out there that has gone through peer review that shows local entrepreneurship is drastically better at creating jobs than large corporations, because their supply chains tend to be local. They tend to hire local workers. Their accountants, their finance folks, their CEOs are all in the region, versus a lot of salary dollars get vacuumed out of Pennsylvania back to headquarters when you invest this much money in an out-of-state or a international corporation. So the next slide talks a little bit about using the wrong industry codes, which is kind of a user error in addition to the struggles with the actual methodology that they used. And we'll talk a little bit about how the 40-year time frame for this facility was probably overly optimistic. They projected this economic benefit for 40 years. Most other evaluations for other sites like this around the world have used a 15-year time frame. 40 years probably will require some other considerations from Shell before that clock runs out. And so Shell might actually, it might behoove Shell to not operate the plant for 40 years. Who knows what the price of things will look like and the maintenance cost will look like in 30 years. So to assume that a plant is going to operate for 40 years and benefit the community is kind of, I would say, a little bit of a naive and overly optimistic estimate. And then finally, they use Shell's analysis as a starting point for all of this methodology. So you've got the methodology problems, but you've also got some of the assumption problems here. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see, I've put in a screenshot directly from the RMU study. If you look at the key assumptions of the study, assumption 5, construction employment generates the Pennsylvania jobs that Shell has projected. So when you're starting out with saying, well, we're going to start with Shell's own estimates instead of go out and actually produce our own estimates based on real life results from other similar projects, you've kind of already gone off the rails. You've kind of already started off on a bad path to have a true independent analysis. And keep in mind, this was the analysis that was really the backbone of the state actually approving a lot of these tax incentive programs and expansions of programs to benefit the project. So I think that's my last slide. We'll go one more and see. And I'll just end my segment with this quote, and I think this is true of economic development strategies that we've seen over the last decades. Governments don't usually know how to pick winners when they get proposals for projects and the government or the state government or the federal government says, oh, this is the next big thing. This is going to help the community so much. They usually don't know how to pick winners, but losers always know how to pick governments. They always know how to lobby the governments for the tax incentive packages to benefit and make their projects viable. And so I think this is a good rule of thumb that I hope folks in the state capital and in state capitals around our region will remember as future projects come down the pipeline, kind of seeking that same kind of preferential tax benefit. And I will pass it over to Kathy to chat a little bit more about Shell's background in the region and kind of why Shell was interested in this part of the country in the first place.
Thank you, Nick, for a great overview. And thank you to Orvie for allowing us to continue our exploration. This is Anne and my second report at Orvie about the Shell cracker plant, and Nick joined us on this third. And I've been looking at the Shell cracker plant actually as a former finance professor and looking at this for many years now. And as part of that, a lot of research I did initially was on fracking and the whole regional focus on fracking. And that's what led me to look into Shell, even before it made the final moves into doing a cracker plant. And so I'm just going to do a brief overview of Shell's own history in Pennsylvania. And it really started with loving the fracking industry. It made a huge acquisition back in 2010. It was known then as SWEPI, that was a division of Shell, and it acquired for 4.7 billion. That's, I put million, it should be billion, and it was really looking at the fracking boom in the Marcellus region. And that was at the very beginning of the fracking boom in the Appalachian region, and also obviously in the Permian, where they were not really fracking as much for natural gas. They were fracking more for oil. So Shell had huge hopes for success in the region. Marcellus has an abundance of both natural gas and ethane, which is a natural gas liquid. It's called wet natural gas. It's different from liquefied natural gas, for those of you who are not as steeped in the whole difference between natural gas liquid, and then also liquefied natural gas. They're all different. What we're focusing on for this report is ethane, and ethane is a feedstock for petrochemicals, for plastics. And the Marcellus and Utica area, these two big basins, have a huge amount of ethane. So once they could frack for the natural gas and the ethane-rich natural gas, the race was on to build ethane cracker plants in the region. Industry groups decided that there was so much opportunity, they shouldn't just build individual cracker plants, they should have a big storage hub, and it should be in the Ohio River Valley, maybe even on the banks or very near the Ohio River, to support expanded ethylene production. And they estimated that there could be several cracker plants and then a whole petrochemical hub that would revitalize the whole region. And the DOE even supported it back in 2018. One thing to note is that because Shell had access to ethane storage elsewhere down on the Gulf, it could use that as storage facility while its plant was under construction. And other potential ethane crackers might not have that same advantage. So in this whole race to build out a petrochemical hub in that area, the race was on to build ethane crackers, and many companies were looking at it. And going back through the research, we saw that many were announced. At one point, Exxon was rumored to be looking for a site. It's not even on this list because they backed away from that. But the one you're all probably familiar with was PTTGCA. PTT is a Thai-owned company, and it was very seriously considering for many years building its own ethane cracker plant. It has never said for sure it won't, but it has moved its focus elsewhere. But it was taking a tremendous amount of money from Jobs Ohio. It actually was breaking ground, it appeared. It was clearing land, but it never made it to final investment decision. A Brazilian company was looking seriously at this. They ended up putting up their land that they had purchased for this for sale. So they are not going forward. And two smaller companies also considered ethane crackers. And the bottom line is only Shell moved forward in 2012. And you can see here what they have produced since that time. And I think it's important just to focus on that was 2012, a full 12 years ago. Much has changed. And our expert on the sort of, global petrochemical industry, Anne, has pointed out that, from a macro perspective, things were very, very different back in 2012. One reason is that they were going to produce chemicals for the region. So this was a Shell executive back in 2011 saying they would use this abundant feedstock, this ethane from the Marcellus, to locally produce chemicals for the region. And a lot of the studies suggested that they could produce all of these petrochemicals, mostly single-use products as it happened, and that there would be tremendous demand within the region. And of course, they talked about how many jobs they would have. But the reality is that fiscal incentives, the two that Nick pointed out at the beginning of this webinar, were keys to the decision. And remember, the three states in this area, West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, were all vying to say, if you're going to build this huge facility, we'll throw lots of incentives at you, but Pennsylvania won the day with incredibly generous fiscal incentives. And a Shell executive said in 2016, they would not have made that investment decision without the fiscal incentives. So where are we now? One thing just to point out is 2012 in the corporate world is a lifetime ago. Importantly, it's 3 CEOs ago. And often a new CEO comes in and says, oh my gosh, I'm inheriting all of the decisions by my predecessors. And sometimes they take big write-offs. They say, we've made a big mistake in the past, and I can blame it on my predecessor, take a write-off, and then start with a clear path forward. And that may be what is happening right now under a CEO that began his term about a year ago. They're doing a strategic investigation now, as you'll see on the next slide. Thank you, Ben. Oh, so the question is, will Shell ever walk away? They're doing a strategic analysis of all of their assets worldwide, including their petrochemical assets, including their fracking assets, including oil and gas everywhere that Shell operated. And the question is, does a big company like Shell ever walk away from an investment and take a write-off? And the answer is Shell has done this numerous times in the last 20 years, and these are huge write-offs often. For example, they walked away from that big investment in fracking in Pennsylvania and Tioga County. In 2020, they sold what they had purchased for $4.7 billion, which did include some additional assets, but they sold its Pennsylvania fracking assets for only $541 million. And the industry press called this a fire sale. So it is clear they are willing to walk away. And right now, as they are doing a strategic analysis, Shell is asking itself, has its plant in Beaver County, again, conceived over a decade ago, has it offered the company the return on investment it initially expected? Our guess, coming at it from a financial analysis, is certainly not. What are the potential returns going forward? The economic outlook globally for petrochemicals is very different than it was over a decade ago. And would Shell ever walk away from these assets? And, we don't know the future, but they have walked away in the past. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ann Keller, with whom I've had the privilege of working on for our third Shell cracker plant analysis. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you to Overy and also the audience that we have today. It's a pleasure to share the information with you. As you noticed, the title of the presentation was The Bad Bets, so I'm using a kind of a poker analogy here. The competition among the states in the Appalachia region for the ethylene cracker was definitely high-stakes poker. Given the amount of investment that was involved initially, the facility was touted as a $6 billion construction project. And as we know, the last estimates we were able to look at from the RMU study in 2021 was that it was probably $9 billion plus. So definitely one of the big projects, a showcase project, high visibility, the type of thing that definitely the government wants to bring out as an example of the work that it's doing for the population. But in this case, you have to think about how this turned out and, who played their hand first, because when you look at the timeline, it's very interesting that some parts of the what I would consider a traditional economic development process were kind of rearranged in the case of this project. So to start with, as we know, the states all competed for the cracker very intensely. In the the overall high stakes game of economic development, site selection and preparation, so sometimes buying the site, preparing the site, actually doing the work to clear it, to handle the environmental issues, to potentially put in utilities, that sort of work. A lot of times that is just part of the ante, table stakes. In the case of Pennsylvania, that piece of it was done with a $10 million grant to assist with clearing the site, which was a zinc smelting facility that was being shut down. So essentially, this was replacing a zinc smelter with an ethylene cracker. And one of the questions that I believe Nick had, and that was raised as part of our contemplation of the study, is that what it actually looked like was that this was sort of a replacement for a facility that was there. So the question is whether you were really replacing, whether you were adding to the new jobs in the community, or whether you were just maintaining status quo and trying to keep jobs that that would otherwise have been lost. The very interesting thing about the process of how this was working from a standpoint of the incentives offered was that you would expect, or what I've seen before in my experience with the petrochemical industry, is that the company announces that it is contemplating an investment in a particular area, sometimes and often names a couple of regions that they're looking at to get things going, see what kind of incentives the regions can come up with. And as part of that campaign, you normally expect to see the estimates, the cost benefit analysis that the RMU study presented, done at the beginning of the exercise. So that is part of the public outreach, if you will, the community sales pitch. Since these projects are often so high visibility, the nexus for negotiating drifts from the local area, where you have multiple communities and taxing authorities involved, to the state, where the state effectively pulls all those negotiations in and works from a high level. And as part of that entire process, and engaging the local population and communities, and explaining to them why this is something that they should support, since in this case, especially the local communities' tax incentive programs were sort of overridden by the incentives that were granted to Shell. You present a study similar to what the RMU study was, which is cost benefit and what it's going to do for the community as a preparatory process. Whereas in this case, as we'll see, the timing was flipped in a way. It was sort of like the deal was done before the benefits were actually quantified and examined. So number one, the property tax exemption is fairly standard for all states, for better or for worse. My familiarity is with the industry primarily in the Gulf Coast, and property taxes are usually waived for a certain time period for these facilities. So nothing particularly unusual there. But in this case, though, the local taxing authorities don't seem to have been consulted about whether or not it would be best for the community to use their property tax exemption programs that were present in their economic development programs, or whether they should go to the state level and expand the Keystone Opportunity Zone. The Opportunity Zone expansion legislation was done probably at least a year before the local community began to discuss the impact on their tax base, and well over a year before the RMU study came out. Ultimately, in around 2013, I believe, there was a negotiation in which the local communities received what's called a pilot, which is a payment in lieu of property tax. And that was to be a substitute for some of the tax revenue that they were going to lose because of the waivers that would be granted by having this site designated under the Keystone, the expansion of the Keystone Opportunity Zone program. What it did was effectively give the local community 110% of what they would have received from the previous site owner operator as their property tax payment based on the value of the property at that time, which was essentially frozen. So an increase in value resulting from a new facility or a different kind of facility was kind of left on the table here. That wasn't really addressed in the RMU study, and the cost issues around that weren't really presented. So we can move to the next slide. So at the end of the day, as Kathy alluded to, the resource manufacturing credit actually won the plant. It was something that none of the other states offered. It's something that actually I have never seen in the years that I've been working with these facilities in terms of a benefit that was granted in order to influence a site selection decision. This particular credit allowed Shell to reduce their taxes by $2.10 a barrel for the ethane feedstock that it would be using in the plant. The interesting thing about it is that once you dig into the details, the ethane's not required to be produced in Pennsylvania. So theoretically, if they needed to bring feedstock in from other regions like the Gulf Coast, they could pull feedstock off that pipeline and use feedstock from other parts of the United States. So in that case, it was sort of a step backward for the fracking industry if the intent was to support continued drilling and production in Pennsylvania, because Shell didn't necessarily have to use Pennsylvania ethane. And in fact, some of the feedstock that they do use comes from Ohio. The other thing is that if since they already received reductions in property taxes, if their taxes could have been less than the credit, possibly. So if that's the case, they could be transferred to other entities, either affiliates or third parties, if the affiliates weren't able to use the benefit either. And those affiliates were addressed in the legislation to be facilities that could be in the plastic business downstream of Shell that use the polyethylene from the plant. So, in a way, it makes sense because it does subsidize the value chain and the built out of the plastics business in the region, which was one of the reasons for putting it there. But when you stop and think about it, that would also provide an indirect subsidy to the industries that were supposedly going to be adding jobs and increasing the tax base due to the ethylene plant being in the region. So none of those analyses, considerations, or costs were included in the RMU study either. And the other thing about the process is, again, it seems like the timeline was a little bit different from what you would ordinarily see in this kind of project, in that the incentives to both expand the Keystone Opportunity Zones to allow for exemptions of most taxes for the site for an extended period of time, and the feedstock credit were passed by the Pennsylvania legislature by mid-2012. So Shell had announced they were thinking about building a plant. They announced they were looking at sites in different places, and especially the one in Pennsylvania. And then the subsidies came in within the same year. But the study that explained the benefits of having the facility in the community wasn't released, or at least the initial one wasn't released, until almost a year and a half after the feedstock credit legislation was passed. So I guess the question arises, why do it if the legislature was already convinced that it was the right way to go? I don't really have a good understanding of why it was necessary, or why it was necessary to do a follow-up either, unless there were concerns in the community about the benefit, but the decision had actually already been made. The other thing is the magnitude of the credit and whether or not the community understood how much, what type of subsidy was being discussed in terms of give back of potential future taxes. There was an interview in 2016, and I think Kathy quoted from it earlier, where the then current Shell CEO said that the incentives were very important in their decision to proceed to the final investment decision and begin construction. And that decision was made in 2016. At the time, one of the representatives for the region, the state representative, mentioned that they felt it was very important, but also said that the credit was only applicable to 30,000 barrels a day of ethane, where in fact the wording of the credit says that it's applicable to all the ethane that the plant uses, and their feedstock capacity is between 90 and 100,000 barrels a day. So based on that calculation, the estimated amount of the credit over the time that it's going to be in effect, which is until 2042, is as much as $1.65 billion, Whereas if it had applied to 30,000 barrels a day of ethane instead, it would only be a third of that, or around 500 million. So still millions and billions, but order of magnitude 3 times what was mentioned in the press conference about the FID. And in the time that I've been working in this industry, I have never seen any other state offer this type of incentive to an ethylene facility. Again, property tax exemptions, site prep, different types of community support in that regard are pretty standard. Basically, table stakes, the price of admission for the community that's being considered. But I have never seen offers to subsidize feedstock costs before or since. And this cost was not included in the RMU analysis. It was very heavily weighted toward the benefit, but there wasn't a lot of cost associated with that. So at this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Ned Katire from the Environmental Health Project, and Dr. Katire will explain to us some more about the environmental and health costs of this facility.
Thank you, Anne, and thanks to Orby for the opportunity to be here and talk to you about some of those healthcare externalities that Nick was telling us about. You don't have to be a doctor like me or a chemist or a climate scientist to know that ethane cracker plants, like the one operating in Beaver County, is a bad deal for local residents and also for all Pennsylvanians. Unfortunately, the expected health impacts, in other words, what usually happens to the health of people living near these facilities, they've been largely ignored or discounted, as we've heard today. Next slide, please. I am the medical advisor for Environmental Health Project. EHP is a public health nonprofit organization that provides wide-ranging support to communities impacted by oil and gas development in Pennsylvania and also in frackland communities across the country. EHP's team consists of public health professionals, data scientists, community educators, analysts, and communications experts working toward the same goal to ensure that public health is central to decision-making related to oil and gas development. Next slide, please. So look, let's remember what the cracker plant was built for, to take fracked gas and produce these tiny plastic polyethylene pellets called nurdles, trillions of them every single year. The nurdles are destined to make more single-use plastic, which you all know is one thing that nature doesn't need any more of. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, public health was not seriously considered before the Shell ethane cracker plant was permitted, because why would anybody want such a toxic neighbor? Since the cracker plant has been operational on and off now for the last 15 months or so, things have not gone very smoothly. Next slide, please. So far, it's been a bad deal for southwestern Pennsylvania and for the people living around the plant. The cracker plant has gotten a lot of bad press, and for good reason. Local residents have been very unhappy with the visible emissions, as well as the odors and the noise and the light pollution. Now, Shell's response is that this is what's expected during the startup of a complex petrochemical operation. But of course, odors and noises and light pollution and sickness are what people experience throughout the lifetime operations of a plant like this. You just have to ask the folks living in the lower Mississippi River Valley, a place they call Cancer Alley. Next slide, please. Now, during this particular episode last April, where the plant released benzene into the atmosphere, Shell told residents that benzene levels were too low to cause even transient discomfort or irritation, and that no symptoms should be expected. However, residents did complain of a bad smell, and it was reported that residents and workers at the plant did complain of health symptoms like headaches, skin irritation, and eye irritation. So the exposure to benzene or to other chemicals was high enough and bad enough to cause symptoms. Next slide, please. The life of those nurdles begin at the wellhead, as you know, where methane gas and ethane are fracked out of the ground. After processing and refining, pipelines and compressor stations move the hydrocarbons to the cracker plant. Methane powers the cracker plant, and ethane is the feedstock for the polyethylene pellets that eventually make single-use plastics and other consumer products. Next slide. This is how we get our methane and ethane nowadays, by directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing, or fracking. Fracking has been underway in Pennsylvania for 2 decades, plenty of time to gather an overwhelming assortment of scientific and medical evidence showing that fracking seriously damages the health of people, the environment, and the planet's climate system. Next slide. This past October, concerned health professionals of New York and Physicians for Social Responsibility released the 9th edition of the Fracking Science Compendium. The new edition contains more than 2,500 citations, including dozens of epidemiological studies, hundreds of other peer-reviewed scientific and medical studies, and hundreds more government reports and media investigations showing no evidence that fracking can be practiced in a manner that does not threaten human health directly or without imperiling climate stability upon which human health depends. Next slide. These are the few of the chemicals that are released in large quantities into the air from the petrochemical factories like the Shell ethane cracker plant. All of them are invisible to the naked eye, and all of them can make people sick. There's nitrogen oxides, which are respiratory irritants that contribute to ground level ozone, which is a dangerous air toxic that stunts lung growth in infants and makes breathing difficult for everybody. Carbon monoxide, toxic to every human. Volatile organic compounds like benzene can cause cancer in children and adults. PM 2.5, or fine particle pollution, causes damage to the heart and lungs, but also the brain and to other organs as well. 32 tons of hazardous air pollutants are, hazardous. 154 tons of ammonia are permitted, and more than 2.3 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions every year are permitted from this facility, and that's going to worsen the climate crisis. Next slide, please. They're not making saltines and Oreos at this cracker plant. There are other compounds of potential concern included in Shell's inhalation risk assessment, including chemicals that can damage the brain and the nervous system, the liver, the kidneys, and other organs, and chemicals that cause cancer. Shell and the DEP know about the potential risk of breathing these toxic chemicals, including carcinogens, 1,3-butadiene, acrolein, benzene, ethylbenzene, ethylene oxide, formaldehyde, styrene, and others on this list. There's a good reason why people living nearby are scared about their health and the health of their children. Next slide, please. People who live near petrochemical facilities like cracker plants tend to get sick. That's just what happens. And the Shell cracker, which is located less than 25 miles upwind from downtown Pittsburgh, is no different. The acute health effects from this sort of air pollution are predictable. Mild exposures to some of these air toxics can bring eye, nose, and throat irritation to some people. Moderate exposures can lead to additional symptoms such as headaches, which for some people can be debilitating. In the event of an accident or during a temperature inversion that traps pollution in the river valley, that happens quite a bit actually, higher exposures might result in more severe symptoms. That's why it's so important for Shell to make sure that people in neighborhoods around the plant are informed immediately without delay of any accidents or any weather conditions that can result in an inversion and higher exposures. That's not happening. Next slide, please. The long-term outlook from exposure to air pollution from a large petrochemical facility like the cracker plant doesn't look any better. We know that people who live and work near cracker plants have higher risks of developing a long list of serious chronic medical problems compared to people who don't live close by. In fact, we know that this type of petrochemical pollution makes people sick from pregnancy to childhood and into adulthood, from the cradle to a premature grave. Next slide, please. Doctors and nurses are expected to advise patients and other members of the community on ways to protect their health and safety. It's important that everybody keep an eye on Shell and to keep an eye out for changes in the air and in the water, and to keep an eye out on health. Residents are encouraged to report health concerns to their primary care physicians or to the Pennsylvania Department of Health as well, but also to call 911 or seek immediate emergency medical care if help is needed. Next slide. So EHP is committed to helping keep an eye on Shell. EHP has supported community organizations such as Mountain Watershed Association, BC MAC, and others to understand the public health impacts of this enormous and highly polluting petrochemical facility. Next, please. In response to rising resident concerns about exposure to air pollutants, EHP conducts air pollution modeling to understand how emissions are likely traveling through the local airshed. Next, EHP supports community air monitoring efforts by visualizing data on our real-time AirView app. Next, and EHP supports public health advocacy by providing guidance such as this educational handout on the health effects associated with different pollutants. Next slide. So that's all I have. I want to thank everybody for listening, and I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Ben.
Thanks so much, Ned, and thank you to panelists. We welcome questions from the audience, either in the chat or the Q&A. We're happy to share that the Cool. And if folks don't have any questions, that's great too. Again, I added a link to the report as well as our digital toolkit in the chat here. I'll make sure to send that around via email also. Let's see, we've got one question. We talked about Shell walking away from other investments. Do we have any extra data on that or other examples that we could share?
Yes, I used to keep track of all of their write-offs quarter by quarter. All companies, all publicly traded companies are required to do an assessment of the value of their assets. And in accounting speak, if an asset goes up in value, you don't increase the value on your books. But if it goes down in value and is expected to stay down in value indefinitely or permanently by investment rules and accounting rules, it must be marked down. So I kept a list. These go from anywhere from 1 billion in some years to 10, 15 billion. They took a big hit after the fracking. They wrote off a lot of their fracking assets around the world. They've walked away from investments in the North Sea. I've got a list. I can send this to the I don't know who asked the question. I can update my list and send it around.
Thank you, Kathy.
I think there's a question I saw that came in about the Arch hydrogen hub projects that were recently announced and the community benefits agreements. So for folks who are unfamiliar, community benefits agreements are essentially written kind of plans and are a required step of a lot of the hydrogen hub investment. Most community benefit plans don't include clawback provisions. And so what you really have to think about with all of these types of economic development activities and promises is if there's not a mechanism in a contract, a legally binding, laid out plan, where if a promise or a benchmark is not met, a community is actually going to automatically be able to receive the foregone tax revenue or any kind of subsidy back. And so really that's what we talk about, not just in the hydrogen hub space, but across the country, is that most economic development tax incentive programs do not have clawback provisions. It is very difficult once you give a tax incentive to get that money back. When you're talking about really small communities and really large companies, if you're talking about litigation processes, that can also be pretty intimidating, right? If it's a local tax exemption trying to reclaim lost revenue up against a large multinational corporate legal team. And so I'm not extremely versed on the individual CBAs, the community benefit agreements in the hydrogen hub. That's something I think probably some folks at Orvie could follow up on who have a little more precise knowledge, but I will just say generally across the country, it's very rare to see an enforceable benefits agreement for large projects.
Thanks, Nick. And thanks, Anne, for answering several questions in the chat here. I'm afraid we are already at the top of the hour, but I've saved the chat. And if you have any additional questions, please do feel free to email us. My email is ben@ohiorivervalleyinstitute.org, and we'll make sure to get those answered. But again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you all have a great afternoon.